Today is Sunday, May the 4th. I guess be with you, 2025, and this is episode 305 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
How is my favorite Dark Lord of the Sith today, Mr. Bell?
Just awesome. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's Sunday, and I'm a week away from a much-needed vacation. So got a little senioritis trying to get to vacation time.
Congratulations on that. Don't fall into any volcanoes. That's all I have to say.
No. I mean, Akron is beautiful this time of year. So
yes. I thought you were going to
no
Dayton.
offense. No offense. Hey, they have a beautiful Air Force Museum in Dayton.
Well,
no
true.
offense to all of our listeners in Akron. I'm just being silly. It's just when I think of like a unexpected weird place to go on vacation, that's the one that pops to mind.
Yeah, Gary, Indiana, I guess, would be another one. Anyhow, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and those of our employers. And also, thank you very much to our Patreon donors. But as we have been doing in the past, we have yet another new sponsor for you to listen to.
And I hope you like it. I mean, we work hard to get these sponsors.
That's right. We're going to cut to that. Today's show is brought to you by Invisicloak, the only security solution that protects your data by making it look completely worthless. Hackers crack into your system and boom! Instead of credit card numbers, they find a bunch of cat facts and expired coupons. Thanks to our patented ObscuraCrypt technology, your sensitive files are transformed into pure digital nonsense. Worried about data breaches? Nah. Hackers won't steal what they think is garbage. Get Invisicloak and use code NOWYOUSEEIT for 10% off. Invisicloak, because if they can't tell what's real, they can't steal it. All right, so hopefully that was useful to you. You can get some mileage out of that. I also do want to say, by the way, it is very important that people support us in our Patreon campaign, because I don't know if you've been paying attention to what's happening, politically in the U.S. There's a move afoot to cut funding to public broadcasting, and I don't know if you know this, but public broadcasting gives about $500 million away, and most people don't understand that about $400 million of that goes to the Defensive Security Podcast, and so if that money goes away, we're going to have some problems.
I did pick which of the yachts you'd have to sell first.
I mean, I'm not looking forward to that. So
look, bandwidth ain't cheap.
That's right.
The amount of AI we have to put into this to make ourselves look presentable.
Yeah. Do you know how many T1s this show has to use? It's freaking crazy.
I remember the first day I worked at a company and we got our first T1, and I thought I was the baddest man on the planet for having a T1. For you youngins, go look up the blazing speed of a T1 and get back to me.
That was some hot shit. So we're going to do something a little bit different this show. I will say, just a reminder that I started the show a long time ago. It's been, I don't know, 13 or 14 years ago, and the intention of it was to help learn from breaches that were happening in the industry. Like, this was I started this shortly after the Aurora attacks, and whatnot. So, like, there was a lot of stuff going on. But what's been interesting in the interceding years is, like, the number of breaches is obviously through the roof. Like, you can't even keep track of them. There's so many that happen. But at the same time, the information about what has happened in them has almost dried up completely. Like, we don't get the juicy details unless it's like some kind of public entity, and even then we typically only get detailed information if there's some kind of court case and it's been disclosed through court proceedings. But in general, we just don't get a lot of information anymore. And so this has made things like the Verizon data breach report and the Mandiant M-Trends report and some of the others much more important and useful in my estimation. So what we're going to talk about today is the Mandiant M-Trends report. And in a future episode, we'll talk about the Verizon DBIR, because I think that's also pretty useful. Now, I think it's important to understand, like, a piece of marketing material from Mandiant. It is based on, its information is based on the collection of incident response investigation services that they provided over the course of the past year. They've been doing this for many years. But that said, there's still some useful information that I think we can talk about. I think there's also a bunch of kind of chest beating type information focusing on like their ability to attribute different attacks to certain actors. And I don't particularly find that incredibly useful. Maybe some people do, but for the purposes of the show, I just don't think that's that's a big focus area. So with that, we'll jump into it. No, they
Yeah, it's.
go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just say really quick that, for those who don't know, Mandiant's been around a long time. Started by Kevin Mandia, bought by Google a few years ago. So to your point, although there's lots of good information in the report, and it does aggregate a bunch of trends and common themes and things that are most likely to bite you, it is certainly going through many layers of marketing and legal review to best express what Google's overlords would like them to express.
Yeah, look, I'm not intending to drag Mandiant here in any way, or Google. It's just that you have to understand that there's bias in this, and some of that bias comes from the fact that it's, like you said, gone through lots of legal and PR reviews. But also, I think perhaps more important is that it's biased based on who uses Mandiant for their incident response, right? So, like, historically, Mandiant hasn't been the cheapest incident response partner on the planet. They've been kind of the primo, like they're who you call historically when things are pretty bad. And so I think there's going to be a natural bias in my estimation based on organizations that are able to afford it, and then also those that perceive the complexity or the severity or whatever of the incident they suffered warrants engaging a partner like Mandiant. And so, and that's why I want to make sure that it's well understood that they may not be representative of the entire universe of incidents that happen in the world, even though what we're going to talk about, I think, is still very relevant and worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's a lot of caveats to look at this at through the lens of what they see, who they get engaged with, what they're willing to disclose. But hey, all that being said, the whole reason we're covering this because it's really useful information about typical likely scenarios that your organization would be faced with.
Exactly. So right out of the gate, one of the most interesting data points they pull out is that 33% of their investigations started with exploitation of a vulnerability. The incident started with exploitation of a vulnerability.
Which surprised me.
Yeah, me too. And that stands in contrast to like the typically held notion that things like phishing and whatnot are the most significant. Now, and by the way, I think this is probably the most prominent indicator of that bias, because I suspect that the companies who are victims who engage Mandiant probably swing more towards those who were the victim of this kind of attack. But that said, it is really interesting, and it's further interesting when we get into it, like what were the top targets of exploitation. They did say that stolen credentials overtook, in their, again, this is in their experience, stolen credentials overtook email phishing as the second most frequent method of intrusion, and that's 16% of intrusions, and 14% were from phishing. So the lines crossed. Let's see, and that really highlights.
And to be clear,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
To be clear, stolen credentials versus email phishing. When they talk about stolen credentials, as I understand it from reading this report, they're talking about various creds that were dumped in either password dumps or leaks or that sort of thing, not something you gave up through a phish.
Correct.
Or social engineering. So it's
Yes.
something that they obtained through some other means other than directly through social engineering.
Correct. Good call out. As they point out, this really highlights the need for multi-factor authentication, basically better identity protection. And that's a very common theme throughout this report.
Yeah, and specifically phishing resistant multi-factor.
Yes. They did make a call out to web compromises. So this is like watering hole attacks, SEO, search engine poisoning, and compromised websites and whatnot, making a fairly significant increase. It's still relatively low, like in terms of occurrence, but it appears to be significant enough that they're making a particular call out. And this historically has been one of the challenges I think that we in security organizations have dealt with. And it's interesting to see this, in my estimation, returning as a more significant threat vector. Because like if you look back 10 years ago, one of the big things we talked about was the need to filter web traffic and whatnot. And here we are again.
Yeah, I think it just shows how much the browser is the central tool now for so many users.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the tool that is most typically attacked through this sort of web compromise. So in my mind, it's, Chrome, Firefoxes of the world's, Edge, Safari. That's really where a lot of the battleground for this sort of stuff is happening. And it's constant. You look at the patch reports for all those tools, and it's a constant flood of vulnerability here, vulnerability there, patched here, patch there. So I'm not surprised. I mean, the other thing is so much of what we do now is a SaaS-based tool, an online-based tool. It's pretty constant. So
the next point they raised is that, and this was a little surprising to me, 8% of their investigations, the initial intrusion vector was previous compromises, which basically means that there was a prior incident that wasn't properly investigated and cleaned up. And I want to come back to that because there's another interesting data point in here and that's coming up in a little bit about the ability, how often they're able to not identify the source of an intrusion. And then they do also make a special call out, which surprises me too. We've talked about this many times over the past couple of months about the prevalence of the North Korean IT worker issue. And we were joking about this before the show, and it is, while it's funny, it's kind of sad. Like, I am bombarded daily with people who are expressing frustration with their ability to get jobs in IT and in security in particular. And here we have a situation where companies are apparently hiring enough North Koreans portraying or masquerading as U.S. people to make it onto these reports. Like, this is I'm really surprised. And I did hear just a separate side report. Side topic. I heard a report recently about because I haven't fully pieced together how all of this works. There's little bits and pieces kind of coming out. The laptop farms where there's been several people arrested in the U.S. for housing these laptop farms where companies that hire these North Korean workers send their devices and that the person that lives there sets it up and then it basically acts as the go-between between the North Koreans and the companies that hired them. But the one thing that I never really fully understood was the identities of the people that they're portraying. And there was just a recent story about, I think it was a hairdresser, or he worked in a salon, and he was basically renting his identity to North Koreans. He was getting paid for people to use his identity to get hired as a, as an IT worker. So, another interesting thing. I part of me wonders, by the way, if there is not some benefit, and I'm very much opposed to return to office. Just going to throw that out there. If there is some benefit, marginal benefit, with return to office as a protection against this sort of thing.
Jerry, would then you be profiling a worker based on what they looked like when they walked into your office after getting off a flight from North Korea? That doesn't seem appropriate.
If they're really tired, I guess that might be an indication something's up. Yes.
No, it is interesting. So statistically, they said 5% of their incidents were due to North Korean seeking employment under false pretenses, leading to an insider threat of various types, which they talk about more later, of whether it's gathering information and then holding it for ransom, exploiting the company, deploying malware, stealing intellectual property, all sorts of different stuff. And they make a call out that it's kind of interesting because we talk about this a lot in the industry, but they say that insider threat has always been the negligible portion of their investigations, which is kind of telling. We talk about it like it's something to worry about, but at least based on this report and their viewpoint of what they see, you can almost make an argument that we spend too much energy on it, if that's true.
So on the one hand, I agree, but on the other hand, I guess I'll counter with, well, perhaps that's because it doesn't, those insider threats don't require a mandiant level investigation, to research. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the joke has always been if it's going to go public and you want to put your best foot forward, hire somebody like Mandiant, because you can say we're hiring the best.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a PR move at that point. Not that they don't do good work, but that has been, the kind of the vibe in the industry for a long time, at least before Google bought them. That they're if you take security seriously, you'll hire Mandiant when you get breached.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, you're probably right. They're probably too expensive for a lot of those situations.
I don't know. I mean, or maybe you're onto something there. We're overthinking it. So getting back to an earlier comment I made, the next point they raise is that 34% of their investigations have an unknown initial infection or intrusion vector. And they attribute that to deficiencies in logging and detection capabilities, which is, it's a third of their cases. They don't know how it happened. They know, I presume they're able to kind of trace what they did once they got in, but they don't know how they got in. And if you don't know how they got in, it's really damn hard. And I speak from an experience here. It's really damn hard to know that they can't get back in. That, right, I think speaks to the earlier point about the 8% that result from prior intrusions. So,
and that's really interesting. If a company like this has been hired to figure it out and kick them out, and they're basically saying we can't in a third of the situations, we can't assure you, that actually has its own very telling deficiency. So the problem I've often thought about with these incident response situations is they're walking into an existing scenario that they did not set up. They don't know what they have. They're maybe not positioned to be successful. It's all very dependent on what logs were obtained and maintained, what evidence is maintained. And I'd be very curious what is missing, or it's tough to know. It's tough to prove the negative here, but if they came out of those with recommendations of, hey, you need to beef up your logging in these areas or your monitoring in these areas so that we have a better chance of knowing what caused these problems in the future.
It reminds me of discussions that I've seen and had and read with pen test companies. And one of the common refrains from these pen test companies is that companies will hire them to perform a test, and they'll be delivered a set of results. Then they'll come back the next year or sometime later and find the very same things. And sometimes they actually find like the same stuff that they left, like their tooling and whatnot, which indicates that the customer basically did nothing. And so I suppose that's not given that context, it isn't unreasonable to think that this is that it happens, right?
Well, it's not that they did nothing. They wrote a check.
That's true. What more do you want? So the next point, this goes back to the third of events that happened as a result of exploitation. One of the most interesting, we talked about this, at least the headline on a prior show, but one of the most interesting headlines in my estimation here is that the most commonly exploited stuff were security devices.
Yeah.
And so the number one most exploited device that led to an intrusion investigated by Mandiant was Palo Alto, so PAN-OS. And then after that, it was Ivanti. And then after that, it was two different Ivanti vulnerabilities. And then it was Fortinet.
Do you think anybody marketing wants to promote that?
I don't think so.
We're the number one exploited publicly facing security tool.
You know, what is interesting to me, I guess, maybe interesting, is that these security companies typically have their own research arms. And they will go off and they will find vulnerabilities and report on vulnerabilities from other companies. But hopefully the question in my mind is obvious. Like, why are they not turning that inward?
You know why. You know exactly why.
I know.
Politics.
I know.
Well, a couple things. Politics, and it's not as valuable to them. That is a revenue generating activity.
Yes.
For them, if they are going to turn it inward, they certainly wouldn't publicize it. They certainly wouldn't. So they may be doing it. We just never hear about it, first off. Second, they're being paid to go find this third parties that they can publish. It's like being in academia. It doesn't matter if you can't publish, right? So they're constantly looking for things to publish. And I imagine there's also a decent amount of political turf wars between the internal engineering teams and the externally facing research teams. At least that's what I typically saw when I worked at various vendors. Now, to give a little bit of grace to these companies, they're incredibly popular. They're very well known. So we're not looking at this in a per capita basis, right? They are by nature on the edge of networks. They have to be. So they're in a very hostile environment. And they had very widely publicized vulnerabilities with fairly easy execution against those exploits. And as we've talked countless times on this show, corporations, for reasons I have trouble fathoming, are loath to patch these devices. So it's more than just, hey, Palo Alto is bad at secure coding, or Ivanti is bad at secure coding. They're not unique in that. I think they've got a confluence of challenges, and also it became very popular in the last 2 years to go after these devices. And we've talked about this before. We have these weird clusters of attack areas that I don't know if one researcher or one exploit team or one bad guy finds an idea, and so everybody else just kind of jumps on that bandwagon and starts testing the same area, and we just have this kind of big dog pile against this type of problem for a while. But I think there's a lot of things that came together to make this the case. My soapbox 2 cents.
I believe, and the one I'm not 100% sure about is Palo, but I believe that each of these impacted components that really shouldn't have been exposed to the internet anyway. I know that is definitely the case for the Ivanti vulnerabilities and for the Fortinet, and I feel confident that the same is true. And so there's, I think, a customer responsibility here too. I'm not saying, I'm trying to victim blame here, right? But if you put things that really shouldn't be exposed to the internet on the internet, you don't be surprised when they're exploited. It's kind of, surface area minimization, very, very basic security concept. And so I'm going to say it again. We need to do a better job of not exposing these sensitive things to the internet. It doesn't mean these companies need to not do a better job at securing their own products. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't also have to patch urgently. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that, like, don't expose stuff, sensitive administrative control panels of whatever it is, firewalls or whatever. Don't expose it to the internet. Like, there's no reason for it.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was trying to look this up really quick for this particular CVE for Palo Alto, and it's a little unclear at first glance as to what, if that is the management console interface that needs to be attacked. And I'm not skilled enough or experienced enough with Palo Alto to quickly vet this, so I don't know. Sorry.
It's all right.
I failed you.
So the next interesting data point is related to detection, and so they've identified that most organizations learned that they've been compromised through an outside source. So 57% of the investigations they were involved in started because they were notified. The victim was notified by an external party, and that kind of breaks down into two different categories, like the adversary themselves or some other third party like law enforcement or some other like threat intel type provider who stumbles on their information. So the majority...
You tell me like a partner third-party risk management team didn't send them a spreadsheet with a notification?
I don't think that happens all that often.
That's not what they show in the movies.
It's true.
Sorry, I completely disrailed you.
So the vast majority of cases are notified by some third party like law enforcement or what have you. The minority is notifications from the adversary, and I think the majority of those are ransomware, basically ransomware nodes. No particular surprise there. So any other points that you had in that section?
No, 14% were detected by adversarial notification, which is interesting. 43% by external entity. That's got to be a rough conversation.
That's the Krebs is my IDS, right? The old joke.
You know, the other thing that's interesting is we get, like in my career, I would say a couple times a month, we'll get somebody who's barking up a bug bounty tree with some sort of fake, I should say, low value alert on a misconfiguration of vulnerability, which is an interesting thing. So I wonder how much of that, I wonder if there's certain situations where if it's not obvious ransomware with popping up on your machine with, hey, you've been screwed, sorry. You get an email from some random Proton address from some bad actor that you blow off because you get so many of those fake, I shouldn't say fake, low value alerts on a regular basis from random people all the time looking for bug bounty or payment.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you, I struggled with that problem, and I also struggled, especially if you're a bigger name organization, I struggled with, I won't call them necessarily legitimate threat actors, but people claiming to be threat actors, claiming to have compromised you, and that drives an incredible amount of work. It's very disruptive. If you have somebody that's running around saying, "Oh, I compromised, ABC Corporation," and you're the security team at ABC Corporation, it becomes on you to prove the negative,
which is next to impossible.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago, I was working somewhere and we got some sort of weird alert from a cloud provider saying that they had detected malicious activity occurring on one of our nodes, but without any other good supporting evidence. And of course, this went to, half the executive team of the company. So, and they couldn't back it up with anything. They couldn't explain it. They ended up giving us like a 12-hour window based on DNS traffic with no other evidence. And we're like, what are you talking about? And we spent a lot of time, a lot of man hours trying to confirm that this host or host near it were not in any way compromised. And it just caused this huge kerfuffle trying to prove the negative because we got an unasked for alert from a cloud provider who, the best we could tell, just had a false positive, but had no real evidence they could back it up with. So it was not a very well thought out or architected alert either, because when we went back and like, give us more evidence, give us more information. What is your detection algorithm trigger on? Like, what? Tell us more. They couldn't. And it was very frustrating.
Yeah. It leaves you very, it leaves you very exposed politically, not necessarily technically, but definitely politically.
Yeah, it's really fun when your VP of marketing gets that email.
Yes. Yes. Tell me that you've resolved the problem. Tell me that you've investigated and found the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I can certainly appreciate that. The next item is related to dwell time, and this also kind of flies in the face of some of what we have been seeing from other reports. And so they're pointing out here that the dwell time in 2024 is about 11 days. And that stands in contrast to some of the other reports and whatnot that we've seen, which indicates that it's on the manner of minutes. And so this is pointing out that it is not that. Now they do break that down, by the way, because as you might expect, different kinds of incidents will have different types of dwell time. So like if you have a ransomware attack, that will typically happen much faster than an APT, that's trying to be slow and quiet. But so if it is an incident that's where you're notified by the adversary, the dwell time is 5 days. And so that'll align typically with your ransomware actors. Whereas if it's an external entity, the dwell time is a lot longer, unsurprising. If it's something that you detect internally, the external entity notification, by the way, is 26 days. And then internally it's 10 days, which is right in line with kind of that average. I will say, by the way, that I have had long ago, I worked at a company who was notified by the FBI that we had a compromised host that was seen attacking some entity, and then they notified us. We, it caused a lot of consternation because that IP address wasn't in use. Like it was ours, but it wasn't in use. And so like we spent an incredible amount of time trying to figure out like how did an adversary figure out how to do well. After a little bit of back and forth with the FBI, we learned that it was like the detection was something that happened years earlier, like many years earlier, when that IP address was associated with an office of a company that had been acquired. So it's not. This is one of those kind of double-edged swords. Like you want to know that it happened, but like it has to be timely enough. And in particular, if you are, my most recent assignment was in a cloud provider, and this was something that was a very big challenge as a cloud provider because like you have huge numbers of customers and they're constantly changing up IP addresses. The people coming in, leaving, and you get a notification from some security researcher or law enforcement or what have you about a malicious IP address. Like you've got to figure out what was the exact window, and like it would have been very helpful if you would have told us 2 weeks ago when that customer was still on the platform. And so I think timeliness is really important in notification.
Yeah, it's maybe not as critical, but I've seen very similar problems with things like Security Scorecard or other similar third-party cyber assurance type companies that I'm not picking on them alone, but I think that their entire methodology is very suspect in the age of ephemeral and rapidly changing IPs in the cloud market, because we'll get something flagged on one of those scorecard type systems that goes out to other third parties who then start coming to us saying, hey, fix this. And we're like, that's not even our IP. That's not us. We don't run that type of system. And this other company has associated that with us and made that part of our infrastructure, and it isn't. It's incorrect. And yeah, you can go work that out. But now I'm wasting a lot of energy and time going and fixing their records for them because they don't know how to identify appropriately what's part of my infrastructure and what isn't. And I get it's a tough problem with cloud environments, but it's going to get a lot worse. And it's very frustrating at times. It feels like those companies are sort of almost extorting businesses to, well, if you sign up for our services and link all of your cloud environments to us, we can better assess. And like, no, stop reporting bad information.
And that was the as the cloud provider, those services were absolute headache. And the common refrain from all of them was, well, if you just subscribe to us, like we can find a way to work together. Like, no, that's kind of like you'd be ashamed if something happened to your
and trying to explain to
reputation.
Customers who maybe are not as sophisticated why this is a false positive or bad info is a big time suck. And yeah, it's frustrating. I mean, that's not really the topic that we're here to talk about, but it is an interesting problem we have with attribution of IP addresses to a single entity these days.
Right. So continuing on, they next talk a bit about the motivations behind attacks, and one of their data points is that 35% of their investigations were attributed to financially motivated attacks,
which I found lower than I would have expected.
I agree. And then they said furthermore, 21% were ransomware, which again stands in contrast to what I would have thought. Like in my mind, damn near everything that's going on right now from an intrusion perspective is ransomware associated. So that is really disabusing me of that thought.
But we go back to what is the bias of the type of incidents that Mandiant gets pulled into. And if they're working more of these more interesting, sophisticated nation state level espionage type things, that may skew their reports. If you go look at somebody who is, I mean this with all respect, more like a mid-market incident response team, I bet they have much higher level of ransomware activity they're responding to. Would be my gut guess on why this doesn't jive with our expectation.
You're probably right.
But that's pure speculation of me accounting for why my gut is wrong and trying to make myself feel better.
This whole show is speculation, man. It's all speculation.
Right. Perfect.
So, anyway, next is that 37% of their investigations involve data theft, and 11% of their cases involved what they call multifaceted extortion, which included both data theft and ransomware encryption, which again is a lot lower than I expected. I've had this in, notwithstanding the discussion we just had about the potential bias. Like I have this thought in my mind that most of these data theft attacks are happening as a result of ransomware attacks, and that most contemporary ransomware attacks involve both encryption and theft. And apparently, at least as it pertains to those that are investigated by Mandiant, that's not the case. Which says, I guess, a couple of things. One is, like, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on. Even if you net out the issue of potential bias, there's a lot of other types of attacks that are still happening. And I will also say that this tells me that there's a lot of room for, I don't mean it the way it's going to sound, right? There's a lot of room for growth in that type of attack, the kind of the what they call it, the multifaceted extortion attacks. There's apparently a lot of room to grow there.
I don't disagree.
So we'll skip down to malware. And in the malware section, they made a couple of interesting comments. And one is that the number of malware families that they are observing is steadily declining. The number of net new malware families is steadily declining. And they attribute that to adversaries relying more on things like legitimate access through credentials and legitimate tools that are like the whole living on the land concept. They don't specifically say that, so I'm kind of paraphrasing. Rather than relying on newly generated malware, they're starting to pivot to other types of attacks. Part of me wonders, like, what is the underlying cause of that? Is that because organizations are getting more sophisticated with their EDR setups, or is it just as a matter of convenience and expediency? And a lot of this stuff is now becoming kind of industrialized, and so from a sheer cost perspective, it's more economical to do this than to continue innovating new types of malware.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it feels like you mentioned, like we're industrializing that a bit, right? You've got and we've talked about this a lot. You've got the initial access broker, you've got the malware providers, you've got the ransomware gangs, and it's if we've got malware and this may go back to why we see so many PanOS get hit so much. If we have a smaller concentration of very effective malware that's being distributed through the bad guy ecosystem, and they don't have to generate their own new tools, they only need tools that work. It's interesting. I did find the rise in Linux-only malware pretty interesting too.
That was definitely something I wanted to talk about. They've observed that the proportion of Windows-based malware is steadily declining, and that's because it's not the amount of Windows malware is declining, but the percentage of solely Windows malware is declining, and that's because that they're observing an increase in Linux malware. And I thought that was an interesting thing to talk about a little bit, because I don't feel like, and maybe I'm way off base here, but I really don't feel like the ecosystem for malware detection and prevention in Linux is very mature.
No, of course not. No.
And so as this trend continues, I think we're going to have a lot of problems, because on the one hand, like, we all joke about how insecure Windows is and how it's a magnet for malware, but the tools that have developed over the decades have gotten somewhat robust, and I think we're not there on the Linux side.
Yeah, and I think that's directly attributed to the rise of cloud, right? So many of your cloud workloads are running on some sort of Linux derivative, or even your Macs are running on some sort of Linux derivative. So there's just a lot more target space out there that they want to go after. And there's plenty of vulnerabilities that come out in Linux all the time. So it doesn't surprise me. And I think in terms of AV, it's almost like we skipped that. Yeah, you could go look at the clam AVs of the world and such for Linux, but I think most modern orgs now have gone right to some sort of EDR, XDR agent running on their Linux host to help detect that sort of things. It's almost like we just bypassed the whole AV cycle when it came to Linux, in my mind, in many ways, compared to Windows, at least.
I think that's true, and I know that at least at the time that Linux antivirus was kind of a burgeoning thing, most of what it detected was Windows malware stored on Linux file servers or file systems. So,
well, I tell you, I think that's very true for EDR and XDR too. They are so built to combat Windows-based ransomware that when you start digging into the weeds of what works on Windows versus what works on Mac and Linux, it is not a parity on those tools. And most of their detections and most of their automatic responses is all geared towards Windows. They are very, very, very Windows-centric. Yeah, sure, they've got agents. And it's helpful if you're tracing a compromise moving from one type of device to another. Maybe it starts on a Windows host and moves laterally into a Linux host. It's very helpful to have that visibility. But I'm trying to this. I'm going to say this as accurately as I can. But when you see things like CrowdStrike saying, we stop breaches guaranteed, what they're really basing that on, in my opinion, without having ever worked at CrowdStrike, this is just my 2 cents as an observer, is Windows-based ransomware awareness and very, very, very good detection around Windows malicious activity, with okay detections around Linux and Mac. But they really focus the vast majority of their energy on Windows environment with those tools, is my perception.
I suppose it's not terribly surprising, because if you are a security company who is building tools that you have to tune to different attack types, you are going to spend your money where most of the attacks are happening, which has historically been Windows. And so I suppose as more of this sloshes to Linux, because as you said, like there's just a lot more Linux out there than there has been in the past. And so it's, I think, a more prominent an attractive target for adversaries. And so I suppose it should be a natural thing that we would see that maturation happening. But I definitely think we're behind the eight ball. So the next data point I thought was interesting was the mix of malware that they observe. And that the most common type of malware that they are seeing is backdoors. It's not ransomware. It's not credential stealers. It's backdoors. It's malware that allows ongoing access, and that
Which
was
could
very
be
surprising.
a prelude to ransomware. It could be something. It could be an initial access broker that is just getting initial foothold to sell access to somebody else via that backdoor. So to me, a backdoor is like the first step of a multi-stage attack, typically, but not always.
No, but they do distinguish it from droppers, and they have this category called other, which includes tunnels and whatnot. But I suppose you're right. Like the backdoors are kind of the least common denominator. It's a thing that many different types of actors would drop for them to do whatever they're going to do. Good sense. But also, by the way, like that's something in order for a backdoor to be effective, you have to be able to either access it inbound or outbound. And so there's also an opportunity, I think, in that to detect it. So I kind of go back to making sure that we have robust controls, especially around infrastructure systems. If you see your web server making unsolicited outbound connections, maybe that shouldn't happen. Maybe.
But the reality is a lot of people don't know enough about the traffic to know what's normal and not normal on outbound these days.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly.
Well, let's see. What is next? So in terms of the most frequently seen malware family, so this is like specific branding, I guess, is the way I'll describe it. They describe Beacon, which is a component of Cobalt Strike, is the most common thing that they're observing. It's It's seen in 5% of all intrusions they've investigated. Now, it's interesting that they have a chart that describes like for the past 5 years, year on year, how frequently they see it, and it peaked in 2021, and it's been precipitously declining. And I suspect that there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of probably the most pressing, is that the industry at large, and law enforcement in particular, and many of the security companies have come to recognize that this is a big problem. And so I think that there's a lot of work that's been done to detect Cobalt Strike, which I think interesting. If you are the company that makes Cobalt Strike, which I think is also named Cobalt Strike, you are, you're left having to improve, but then when you make those improvements, you can kind of see the problem, right? It's an arms race.
Like everything in InfoSec.
Yeah. So let's see. They spend a lot of pages on attribution, which I'm not interested in talking about here. So I'm going to skip past that, and then down to a bit more on initial infection vector. And I'll just read it. This is a quote. So, in contrast to the overall data set, the most commonly observed initial infection vector for ransomware related intrusions, where the vector could be identified, was brute force attacks, which again was not something I was expecting. And so they're saying things like password spray attacks on VPN appliances is the most common method of ransomware infection. which again,
which is just
we
stunning to me. What is it going to take to get people to use multi-factor?
right. So even like we talk about the urgency with which we need to move to phishing resistant multi-factor, passkeys and whatnot. But just even the simplest multi-factor would be a big improvement in this particular attack
Yeah.
type.
Yeah. I mean, as much as people hate it, even SMS
Even
would stop
SMS
some.
would, yes.
It would force at least one extra bad guy step to, do a SIM swap and capture that SMS message or something. But
right. They mentioned, by the way, there's a very, very interesting tie here. They mention RDP. So RDP is also one of the protocols that are the victim of these brute force attacks. There was a report, I think, within the past week about how RDP, and I don't know if it's all environments or just environments where it's, you have Active Directory in the mix, which is my favorite thing ever. It will allow the use of cache of old passwords, right? So it's because it's a safety thing from according to Microsoft, so that if if your system gets isolated from its domain, you're still able to log in using the prior credentials. And so that means that even if you were to change a password, it doesn't necessarily mean that your RDP, which should never be exposed to the internet, by the way, is safe. So I don't care if you're using multi-factor authentication. You should not have RDP exposed to the internet.
yeah, and that whole Windows thing or password situation with RDP was interesting, and it's such a perfect example of usability versus security.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole concept of, well, you can't you're locking me out too easily when something expires. I need to be able to get into this host and manage it, and
Mm-hmm.
I can't do it now, and now I've got to dispatch somebody to go put hands on keyboard. I can't, that's too. You've got to find a solve, and I'm sure a project or a product manager decided this was the right solution to. All right, fine. If it's expired, make it still valid for RDP, because this is a remote access tool that probably is being used for some sort of maintenance issue, and people are not going to adopt our tooling, and they're going to bitch and complain if we don't do this. And such a perfect example. I don't even know if I'm explaining it well, but I can see very easily how that conversation could have happened as a product manager over that functionality.
I think it's a miss. It's an example. More importantly, it's a miss in expectations between the IT community and and the manufacturer. So like I can understand the reason why they have it. It makes sense. Like it makes intuitive sense. I'm not saying I agree with it or don't agree with it. I mean, it is what it is. I think most of the reason that the industry is having such a visceral reaction to this is that like it doesn't make sense on its face. But when you understand the motivation, it does. But it really points to the reality that exposing RDP is a real risk, and one more log on the fire why you need to be very cautious when you're using RDP.
How is my remote North Korean admin going to get in if I don't expose RDP, Jerry?
That's a great question. A great question. All right, so I'm going to skip down a bit. They do some decomposing of dwell times based on a different kind of a matrix. I'm going to skip past that. And the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was we talked about how they're seeing less reduced frequency of new malware because they're seeing increased use of tools and what they call utilities. And so they have a comment in here about how they're seeing 37% of the tools used in intrusions were what they call utilities, which was things like PsExec and or the
things that we've often called living off the land, right?
right.
Using existing tooling in the operating systems to further your attacks.
Yeah. And so they're using these as in many different contexts to perform reconnaissance, to perform lateral movement, and many other things. And the challenge is that because they're often used for legitimate activities in an IT environment, a lot of times they're like alerts that involve them are quiesced. You're turning off alerts in your EDR console and whatnot because they're expected. But that's exactly how some of these attacks are being conducted, using these tools and relying on the fact that you're blinding yourself through their use.
You know what would help?
Your mom?
AI. Yeah, that too. I am launching an AI model called Your Mom. It goes down a lot, but it'll be effective.
Oh.
But those tools are absolutely launching the whole, well, with better AI, we could determine what is appropriate admin activity and what is a bad guy, coming from various bad guy places doing bad guy things at bad guy times.
Absolutely. All right. So skipping down a bit, they get into some specific attack types like cloud compromises, and they pointed out that 39% of cloud compromises result from credential theft via phishing. And then the next most common is credential theft via other means. So again, like stolen out of other data breaches and whatnot. Let's see. So then I'll just read this quote. In terms of objectives, data theft, this is again in the context of cloud. In terms of objectives, data theft was observed in nearly 2/3 of cloud compromises. Over 1/3 of cases were financially motivated, including data theft, extortion without ransomware encryption, business email compromise, which again leads me to think that they have maybe a broad view of what they're calling cloud, to include things like email services, the ransomware, as well as cryptocurrency theft and employment fraud. Let's see. So I'm going to skip down a bit more. Again, they spend a lot of time talking about threat actors. They do some decomposition, which might be interesting. I'm not going to cover it here, based on geographies. I think it's interesting, but the reality is like I'm more interested in the tactics and the results. If hopefully that makes sense. So let's see. The next is there's a section on info stealers, and they go through quite a bit of information. I think info stealers as a concept are pretty self-explanatory, but they did have some recommendations that I thought were worth just reiterating. And so I'll read the quote here, because again, I'm focused on like what can we do to be better at this. And the recommendation is to mitigate the risk of info stealers. Mandiant recommends organizations leverage adversary in the middle resistant multi-factor authentication. So is speaking to passkeys, basically, or some other type of hardware-based token. Organizations should consider implementing cookie expiration and password rotation policies to require regular password changes for accounts. And I wanted that it was that particular sentence that made me want to call this thing out, because I see an increasing amount of movement away from rotating passwords.
Well, NIST told us we didn't have to.
I know.
However, they don't really differentiate between human and non-human passwords, user accounts, system accounts. I am starting to drift towards some regular rotation of system account passwords and service account passwords.
I think they all
those
need
get
to be
leaked. Yeah, and I think the concept, if you build from the beginning with the concept, you're going to have to rotate this password, and you find a way to make it less painful, I think you're far better off. And they talk about it later here too, about having tools that do temporary just-in-time passwords, that sort of thing. But I do feel we've seen some more chatter on this. We've talked about it on the show a little bit. We're seeing various companies start to pitch their shiny black boxes around this, but service accounts and those sorts of non-human accounts are starting to become a very big attack vector that we do not manage well, because they're not interactive accounts.
And it's not a case where I think one of the reasons that we got here was that it was expected that people wouldn't be interacting with those passwords, and so therefore they would intrinsically be more safe. But the reality is these things are often ending up in GitHub repositories and
open APIs everywhere.
Right. And so as a result, if we're building these systems with an assumption that they're not going to have to be changed, or like if they have to be changed, it's going to just be a lot of effort and we're okay with that. I think that creates a big problem. And so like you said, I think we have to be designing our systems and our management systems with the understanding that we're going to rotate them on some periodic basis, and that will then also enable us to rotate them on a emergency basis, without potentially having to break everything. Because I think far too often we end up in this situation where like we're faced with the decision of like, okay, well, we've had a credential leak, revoke it or expire it or whatever, like it's going to break our application and it will take us hours or days or weeks to get back up and running, and therefore like that's just an untenable position. Whereas if we go into this with that in mind, I think it's just a much more elegant solution. And by the way, I also think that it's just good practice, because what we've seen a lot of times is that these credentials get baked into code, and they're not necessarily leaked immediately. They're leaked after some period of time. Like and if you leak a password that's no longer valid, it's not great form, but it doesn't create an exigent risk to your operation.
Right. Agreed. And the other thing on that I would say is that you never know when they might get leaked. If you've got very long-lived password lives, it's almost like the length of time. There's probably some ratio of the length of time versus likelihood of getting leaked, some correlation there. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was going to say. Sorry. This whole password rotate thing and being able to build rotation feels very similar to typical tech debt. It's not a high-value activity that does much for us, so we keep putting it off until it becomes a nightmare.
Right. Yeah, and until it becomes an issue. It's the same discussion with disaster recovery or what have you, right? It's nobody wants to spend money on it until it becomes a problem, and then it's an emergency, and then
Indeed.
Then you get the funding to do it. So I'm going to skip down a whole bunch and jump to a section that's called Evolution of Data Theft in the Cloud, Software as a Service Environments. They have some interesting discussions here as it pertains to how they're seeing the interplay between on-prem and cloud/SaaS environments materializing as risks. So there's some thoughts that I wanted to cover in here, unless you have something in a prior section.
No, I think I did capture a couple of notes about, we talked about mitigating risk. So just briefly covering a few things. What they recommend, well, we talked a ton about multi-factor authentication. That's phishing resistant, although they use adversary in the middle resistant. Okay, that's fair. Such as hardware security keys, mobile authenticator apps, FIDO2 keys, that sort of thing. Implementing cookie expiration and password rotation policies. We talked about that. Restrict access from unknown or untrusted locations. That can be a challenge when you've got a remote workforce who are highly dynamic in the IPs they're assigned. So that can be an interesting problem. They mentioned deploying EDR and, tuning it, which I think goes a long way for a lot of this. Quote, when configured and monitored effectively, these tools can provide comprehensive protection by detecting, preventing, and eradicating infections. That's true. This is kind of in their info stealer section, but I think a lot of this advice is fairly applicable to almost all these things. They talk about controlling your browser and user browser better, restrict third-party cookies, disable the use of autofill for passwords, which is interesting. So I think that has to do with various hostile websites stealing passwords from the browsers. Disable browser extensions that have not been approved for use. That's another interesting big one that I don't think a lot of organizations have their hands around, much less any sort of vulnerability management program around. They have a couple of interesting things here too about personal devices and BYOD, design policies and establish restrictions regarding appropriate use cases, and ensure that additional measures such as endpoint instrumentation for BYOD devices and MFA or passwords are conditions that must be met for use. So sometimes you'll get some pushback on that. You want to deploy some sort of mobile device management or monitoring tool to a BYOD device like a an iPad or a phone or whatever, you get some pushback, but I think they're right. It's very important. So yeah, review security controls of third-party suppliers and contractors. Make sure they're enforcing controls on their own devices to limit malware threats, of course.
Send them a spreadsheet.
Correct. Sophisticated spreadsheets. That is exactly right. Other thing they say here, organizations should establish software use policies, conduct training to prevent users from downloading software from untrusted sources. Good luck with that. Because as we've been talking about in recent shows, trusted sources like GitHub and NPM repositories can have all sorts of bad stuff in it. Organizations could also consider implementing an enterprise application store where end users are empowered to download approved applications, implying only from the enterprise store. IT staff should validate these applications to ensure they are free from malware prior to being made available. Again, agreed, limit your exposure, but we also see supply chain attacks against legitimate, known good software that auto-updates with malware. So that's not a panacea, but some good advice I wanted to call out.
So there's some things I thought were really worth talking about here. One was that I'll read this just as a quote. Throughout 2024, Mandiant observed attackers increasingly eschewing traditional on-premise network infiltration in favor of targeting cloud-based stores of central authority, such as single sign-on web portals, which is interesting, and it kind of dovetails into some other points that they make, which is that the more a customer understands their subscription, talking about SaaS or cloud subscription, and the breakdown of responsibilities and the means through which an investigation may be performed, the better prepared they are to not only withstand attacks, but also to investigate them. If an organization mistakenly believes that that security is the sole responsibility of the provider, the security of the data applications and access controls in the environment can be placed at risk. I will tell you. I will tell you that this is, as a CISO of a cloud provider, this is one of the most common problems I ran into. Was customers who thought that we were protecting their workloads from ransomware attacks.
Right. Why aren't you? What's the matter with you?
We don't have that technology doesn't exist. You can buy backups and that. There's lots of ways that you can mitigate that, but I think there's a broad misunderstanding in certain segments of the IT market on what you get when you outsource your IT. Getting into some more interesting things, Mandiant has encountered multiple organizations that do not fully understand the implications of their specific subscription levels within the cloud and SaaS platform. So again, that they're basically seeing the same thing that I saw. One of the most significant challenges in securing cloud environments is gaining the appropriate level of visibility into the environment. Now, I think this aligns really well with what happened with Microsoft. I guess it was 2 summers ago now, where they had their big breach and a lot of customers were impacted, and only those that had the E5 level logging in their subscription were able to actually investigate whether or not they were or how they were impacted.
And you've talked a lot about that one.
Yes.
As not to put words in your mouth, but as you educated me on, it's not as simple as just give them the logs, because there's a direct cost associated with that somebody has to absorb.
Right.
Yeah.
It was a challenge. I had the opportunity to testify to the CSRB, which is now not a thing anymore. CSRB was the Cybersecurity Resiliency Board.
Let's see. You testified and they went away. Coincidence?
Probably not. They ran away screaming. But it was in the aftermath of the Microsoft breach, and one of the thing they were trying to figure out was what the U.S. government's position on SaaS and cloud provider logging should be. And look, it should be those logs should be available, but you can't expect providers to hold them for free. Like if you generate terabytes of logs per day, that costs money. That costs real money, and so you shouldn't expect that. But we should make them available through some means, because a lot of companies want to suck them into their SIM or what have you, and that should be able to happen.
And then you get into retainment, right? How long do you want the logs? And
exactly,
online and cold storage, there's so many caveats to get into this. Are real costs.
Now the one of the more interesting. I think we're getting down to the end here, but one of the more interesting aspects of this was a discussion they have about tooling. We have talked in the past, and this has been a fear of mine for a long time, about IT and security tools being abused because we often think about how do we protect the HR system or the payroll system or the accounting system or what have you. Meanwhile, like our Jira system or our Jenkins system is just got its ass hanging out, flapping in the breeze, and we at some point those are going to become big problems, and they increasingly have been. And so in this particular discussion, again regarding what they call common themes in cloud compromise, I'll just read the quote here. For example, Mandiant has encountered environments where customers have deployed endpoint detection and response tooling across all cloud hosted virtual machines, while administrator access to the EDR are managed through a federated identity provider. Protections are often not designed to secure the EDR admin console in the event the identity store is compromised. Were an attacker to compromise the identity store in an environment such as this, they will be able to access the virtual machines in the cloud environment through the EDR agents directly. So basically, using EDR to push your malware or
Yeah,
do whatever.
I was reading that too, and it's like they're not wrong, but using some sort of single sign-on federated login has a ton of upsides too, and a ton of benefits. And so we're now trading risks. We're concentrating risk in one area. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
well, so I guess I read it a little bit, maybe a little bit differently in that I'm not sure that they're necessarily saying that federated identity is the problem here. I think what they're saying is that the lack of properly isolating or protecting the admin consoles is the problem. And so this they do later in the guide, they talk about the importance of using privileged access consoles so that those privileged identities, whether or not they're coming from a federated identity store or not, should only be usable from a well-controlled set of infrastructure that doesn't have things like email access and crap like that.
So some sort of like jump host that is well protected that you go through to get to these admin consoles for your most critical tools.
Yes.
Kind of a pain, but I see the point.
Yep. Let's see. Then they talk a little bit about some of the more common issues they observe: identity solutions that lack sufficient security controls, improperly secured on-premise integrations, and then poor visibility into cloud attack surfaces. They do talk about some of the challenges that come along with where attackers are using on-premise. So that if you have a blended Active Directory environment and they're attacking the on-prem component of that, which would then in turn give them access to your cloud environment. And so they're prescribing caution when you are intermingling these environments, which I think makes good sense. They do have, this is another quote, I think, and it mirrors something that you read earlier about Mandiant regularly observes organizations that are not protecting privileged accounts with MFA. The absence of MFA leaves these accounts vulnerable to basic credential attacks, such as password spraying and credential stuffing. And by the way, like anybody who runs any system on the internet has seen this. Like your SSH logs are full of your syslog is full of SSH attempts en route. Like it just happens all day long, every freaking minute of every day.
Which you can report to your management as attacks you successfully defended.
I love it. Yes. But then they say, even when implemented, MFA methods such as SMS, phone calls, or push notifications are susceptible to a variety of bypass techniques. These include adversary in the middle attacks, account takeover via manipulation of MFA registration processes, social engineering, SIM swapping, intercepting MFA codes, and exploiting MFA fatigue, which we have seen in the past, although we haven't talked about that in a long time, where your victim gets just bombarded with MFA requests And eventually they capitulate and just say, yes, I accept that was me to make it go away. Um, Additionally, many organizations do not secure the MFA registration and modification process sufficiently, which allows attackers in possession of compromised valid credentials to register their own MFA methods and continue.
Dude, I'm just trying to patch stuff from 2019.
Yes, many is frequently observed attackers exploit password reset portals and related technologies to obtain credentials. Now, I think a lot of larger organizations do create these portals to minimize HR, or I mean, help desk
Yeah.
load.
Self reset with some sort of methodology. So yeah, your help desk isn't slammed all day long with people who lock themselves out. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you don't configure them just right, yeah, you could open yourself up to this. Absolutely.
Right. Even with state-of-the-art cloud security controls, improperly secured integrations with on-premise systems can allow attackers to bypass these controls and compromise an account. And the context there is like if you're using the same patch management tools or asset management tools or whatnot across environments, and just like in the case of the EDR console we just talked about, if an adversary is able to compromise your on-prem instance of that, they can use that to access and potentially control and infect and compromise, basically all of your environment. And this is the what we've talked about in the past, like the need to protect your vulnerability scanner, right? Where if think about the nightmare scenario that an adversary compromises your vulnerability scanner, like you're seeing expected activity emanating from your vulnerability scanner, except this time it's being sexually adversary controlled traffic. They had a couple of other there's a section on security recommendations. I'm just going to hit the highlight, like the headlines. Reducing the impact of stolen credentials. I think that comes down to overprivileged. Like, make sure that you've got your credentials properly privileged. And I genuinely don't think we spend enough time, especially in the context of cloud environments, on properly privileging our accounts. Like, it's so easy and convenient, and it's such a big hassle. It can lead to disaster if we're not careful. Next is protecting cloud infrastructure from on-premise compromise. So again, we just talked about the many ways that can happen. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of blending of infrastructure. The challenge, I think, is that infrastructure tends not to be managed in the same way with the same level of visibility and control. Align logging and detection strategy with cloud threats and risks. So again, making sure that you've got the the right level of logging in place, and that is not necessarily always obvious in the context of a cloud. Like, you don't have to worry typically about someone running into your data center and shoving a server in the rack and using that to attack other systems in your environment, but you do have to worry about that in a cloud context. And then they go into a big discussion about cryptocurrency, and frankly, I couldn't give a crap about cryptocurrency because despite the many emails I've gotten, I still think it's a big racket.
Man, that's going to upset 3 of our next sponsors.
It is. In I guess in closing, it's a good report. It's like 100 pages long, almost 100 pages long. I think it's worthwhile reading. There's something in here for everybody. They do spend a lot of time talking about attribution, which I don't find particularly valuable when thinking about how I go about securing my environment, because like I'm more focused on what do I need to do? And so it's interesting, and certainly, as we've talked about in the past, different types of management care more or less about attribution and whatnot. But I think there's a lot of good information from the perspective of the incidents that Mandiant's responded to here, because these are actual things. Like, they're not hypotheticals. They're not coming out of some framework. These are the results of perhaps thousands of individual incidents that Mandiant has responded to. And therefore, it's worth, I think, our time and attention on making sure that we're not going to be able to afford to do all this crap. And I have no misconception about that. But we should be really thinking very hard about what is most relevant to our environment and react accordingly. And this stuff kind of, by the way, just as speaking as a CISO, this is useful input when you're creating your strategy and your budgets and whatnot, because you now are not coming up with things out of your own head. Like, you actually have something that is coming from a generally respected and well-known entity that you can rely on. So there you have it.
Yeah, and if you're not the CISO, you can take these reports to help advocate for what you'd like the CISO to support and fund.
Absolutely. So there you have it. Hopefully that was a good discussion.
I don't know. I fell asleep a half hour ago, so.
I noticed. Anyhow.
No, it's good stuff. And hopefully, I know it's a long show. We're an hour and a half in, at least pre-edit. Hopefully folks found value. Let us know. Drop us a line. Tell us what you think.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And just a reminder that if you do like the show, you can support us through Patreon. I'll make sure the link is on the show notes. And I will, by the way, include a link to the M-Trends report in the show notes. Just go to defensivesecurity.org, look for episode 305, and you'll find the link there, as well as the link to our Patreon page. Whatever else we can stuff in there. So, in the meantime, where can people find you on social media if they want to talk to you?
I am on your amazing InfoSec.exchange Mastodon server at Lerg, L-E-R-G. Also on X at Lerg, L-E-R-G. And on LinkedIn. Though you have to wade through the thousands and thousands of very sad salespeople who wished I would have gone to RSA, who are clamoring for my attention right now to reach me on LinkedIn. But feel free.
I have had so many annoyed LinkedIn DMs that I'm not at RSA, or that I wasn't at RSA, because everybody wanted to have coffee or whatever. Like, I'm going to be able to buy anything.
It is kind of funny, just to riff on LinkedIn and RSA for just a moment. I see two types of posts about RSA. It's pointless. It's a waste of time. It's too big. It's too commercial. It's too salesy. This is the worst thing ever. Why do I bother? Versus, this is the best event of my year. I'm so happy to be here. This is the best thing ever. And it's like, this is LinkedIn in a nutshell. Everybody's got a hot take one way or the other. Everybody's got such strong opinion one way or the other. Or at least that's what's bubbling up through the algorithm for me. And boy, LinkedIn has gotten weird lately.
Well, I think one of the issues is Microsoft appears to be trying to position it more as a general social media service and maybe less as a professional thing. So I think we're starting to see that take root. And so, yeah, it's a weird place. I don't like it. I think it's a lot of brown nosing baloney.
It is amazing how much, with respect, false, insincere cheerleading you see on LinkedIn. It would be career limiting, but every so often I'm tempted to go, yeah, you guys are all having wonderful conversations. Now let's talk about the worst person you ever worked with. Come on, let's go.
There's a lot of sucking up that happens, and it, like you said, it seems very insincere. It seems like people are trying to pave the way for a potential next move, and so it just feels icky to me. Like it.
Yeah, it's a weird situation out there, and I don't know. I also think that a lot of the posts and a lot of the replies are now being driven by AI. I think people are just generating content with AI, and you can kind of detect it right now. You can kind of detect the tone, and it's very automated AI feel.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, people don't realize it, but this whole show was AI. Like,
I didn't know you're going to tell them.
Like, we're both somewhere else. This is.
Look, when you produce 304 episodes, you can tell AI to just riff, and it will.
Yeah. Go do more of that. Anyway, you can find me on infosec.exchange. It's at Jerry at infosec.exchange. And again, for the podcast is defensivesecurity.org. And with that, we will talk again soon. We will we'll work out coverage of the show while Mr. Khaled is making sacrifices to volcano god or something.
I'm gonna need some hair and your firstborn.
Oh dear, I don't know. My firstborn might have something to say about that.
I didn't say I was going to sacrifice him.
Fair point. Anyway, have a great one, everybody. Take care.
Have a good one. Bye.